Confirm can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thanks very much, Mohammed and Dave. So as Mohammed mentioned, talking about location intelligence, quantifying the urban experience. What I mean by urban experience is character and place. Both of these terms are becoming more familiar for urban designers and architects, particularly in New South Wales at least, but I imagine also elsewhere. Character and place talks about the attributes of place that make it as it is. How do people understand that place different from others and what makes it unique? When we talk about character and place, there's something familiar that comes up and is becoming more prevalent in our discipline in New South Wales, and that's a respect for country. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. And if anybody hasn't seen it yet, there's a draft Connecting with Country Place framework coming out. It's developed by Government Architects New South Wales. And there's a very good quote in it. Aboriginal people's continued connection with country over the course of millennia is a source of valuable wisdom and knowledge that can guide all of us to improve the way we plan and design the places where we live, work and play. The place where I live is Thryde. In Indigenous country terms, that's Wallumedegal. The interesting association that Aboriginal peoples have with place and character is told through stories. And doing a bit of research for where I specifically live is as a secondary name, it's called Charity Creek. And Charity Creek originated as Murema or Garama in the Indigenous language, meaning black bream, a type of fish, because it was quite familiar with as a fishing place. The importance of this is really interesting because it's still a strong fishing location. There's still people down on the ferry wharf fishing today. So it means that the stories that we tell and the identification of place carries on through generations and different types of people as well. What we always do as urban designers is understand the strategic context where a policy or project sits. In recent years, there's been some additional documents come out that help you place your project within a kind of character and place lens. These ones are like Better Place by Government Architects New South Wales, the Local Character and Place Guideline by the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and the Practitioner's Guide to Movement and Place. There's obviously far more of these, but generally speaking, these are the overarching principles that have an understanding or reflection on what character and place means for urban design, and how do you actually approach character and place. In Better Place, there's a series of objectives that understand how to actually make a better place, as the title suggests. Number one is particularly relevant to what I'm going to talk about, which is place-based design and understanding of character. Objective one, better fit, contextual, local, and of its place. Now, good design in the built environment is informed by and derived from its location, context, and social setting. It is place-based and relevant to and resonant with local character, heritage, and communal aspirations. It also contributes to evolving and future character and setting. But what is place? To step back a little bit, placemaking is a new term, relatively, in the scope of our discipline. Placemaking in itself has actually become its own discipline. There's particular people out there that only specialize in place, and that's it. Place to everybody is different, or it should be different, because it's made up of very specific attributes. Two of those types of attributes could be measured in a sense, so physical form and activity. But the other, identified in Practitioner's Guide to Movement and Place, is meaning. What places share is how they are commonly valued and identified with by local people and communities. This value and identity is typically built over time through the interdependent relationship of people and their environment, experienced as a sense of belonging. So there's a couple of keywords in there. So community, people, identity, belonging. all of these things are almost impossible to map. Like to me, place could be, it's about the trees and the life and the activity. To somebody else, it might be materiality, it might be where they grew up. It's a completely different factor of meaning to everybody and everybody else. So how do you identify place if a big part of what place is completely different? But balancing those two things, if you can do it, so if we have a look at those things, physical form and activity, and then meaning. Physical form and activity are those objective parameters of place. They're truthful, they're measurable, they're fixed. Whereas on the other hand, the subjective parameters of place, so that meaning, it's intuition, it's ephemeral, it's unmappable. If we're going to totally represent good urban design, then the balance that you take towards subjective and objective approaches to character and place should be, like I said, a balance. The objective ones can be generated through data, quantitative mapping. The subjective ones are generally done through experience. Like we said before, it's identity and it's belonging. You can map some of those things, through on-the-ground surveys and talking to people, but you'll never fully understand what it is from a broad scale across everybody that ever uses that place. So when we talk about quantifying place through that objective lens, there's different scales of data and quality of data that comes with those to be able to correctly identify the correct attributes and to be able to map them correctly. What we generally find is that as the scale increases, the quality of and the usefulness of quantifiable data becomes stronger, but the ability to map the subjective aspects becomes less so. So on a national scale, you can imagine trying to ask everybody in the country how they feel about place and what that place means to them. It'll be exceptionally difficult. But on the other hand, you've got very broad characteristics that can be mapped through a variety of different like geospatial technologies or the census as such. As we get closer to the lower end of the scale, town center and street, it kind of flips itself around. So the quality and accessibility of data for the subjective items becomes more thin. It becomes difficult to objective ones become difficult to provide detailed enough and measurable enough data to respond to a very specific locale. So if you're talking about a street or a little park or a small building, the data about those things is very hard to grasp and come across in significant enough detail and quantity to be able to actually make sense or be able to do quantify on a reasonable enough level. But on the other hand, the subjective qualities for those local places becomes easier to map because you're talking about a smaller place. So you can ask a few people what that means for them, and you'll be able to map that a little bit easier. You might be able to map pedestrian movements to see how active that place is as well. So mapping and quantifying data on a smaller scale is easy on one part and hard on the other. And then on the national thing, it flips itself. So a couple of famous quotes to kick into a couple of case studies that I'm going to show you in regards to what we've been doing at SJB in terms of quantifying character and place. As we mentioned before, the national scale versus the subjective and objective things, they're flipped, right? So Jane Jacobs quite famously said, talking about organized complexity, is that cities deal simultaneously with a sizable number of factors which are interrelated into an organic whole. So it's kind of talking about the complexity theory of cities. It's saying that each and every reaction has multiple other reactions. And to be able to track all those through the lifetime of a city or a place, it's going to become exponentially difficult to map. Louis Betancourt, a professor in science of cities, also did a little study on this kind of idea of organized complexity. And he actually devised an algorithm for understanding how many different interactions happen within a city. And then I think the number was more than the amount of atoms in the universe. So you can imagine in one single city how you would actually map the quantify characteristics of place and character when those places are so ephemeral and they're based on reactions to other things as well. So understanding that, what is the role of technology? So Cedric Price quite famously said, if technology is the answer, what is the question? What he means by that is, if you're using technology to devise a solution to something, what is the question of a thing that you're trying to solve? So in this sense, what we're trying to use is technology to reduce the complication of identifying character and place. And I'll pick through some of those questions again later on. So if we are to use that data, like I said, to our technology, as I said, to unpick the characteristics of place, it's important to understand what are the characteristics of place, those attributes that make it different. Local character and place guideline and the practitioner's guide to movement and place both have these character wheels, in a sense. Around the character wheels are a number of attributes which they believe you can map to understand what a character and place is. Broadly speaking, they typically fall under the three schema of social, economic, and environmental. A lot of them are to do with open space, movement, and built form. And generally speaking, none of these speak to the ephemeral qualities of place. They don't talk about what it actually means to something. So there's a bit of a black hole in terms of character and place attribution in New South Wales. So how do you fill that hole in a sense? At first, let's have a look at identifying the character and place through these two wheels. So one project that we did this on was West Ryde Town Centre Master Plan. What we wanted to do is analyze all those different attributes of character and place to understand what they actually meant to that place and what significant difference could be attained from understanding those characteristics. So through a method of GIS and majority open source data, we did a mapping exercise where we compared West Ryde to I think it was 8 other town centres. You're just seeing 4 others here: Eastwood, Petersham, Leichhardt and Crow's Nest, all in New South Wales. The intent of this was to understand what are the characteristics of West Ryde and how do those characteristics deviate from other town centres. We specifically chose these other town centres because they're quite successful. They're nice places to be, and places that when you think of a good town centre in New South Wales, this is what you might think of. Again, that's subjective. That might be different per person. And what we use that data for is, in essence, as an example here, when we're looking at tree canopy coverage and vegetation cover, is that in West Ryde, within the town centre boundary, there's only a 6% tree canopy coverage. Whereas in Eastwood, you get 9.5%. In Petersham, you get very high at 13.1%. So you start to understand where these other town centres are performing. And for instance, if you wanted to be like Petersham and a high tree canopy coverage, what you then need to target in your master plan is increasing West Ryde's tree canopy coverage from 6% to 13.1%. Of course, again, just because you change that one thing doesn't mean that place is nice, but there are multiple other attributes that you want to do. So that's what we did. As a broad characteristic, what we set for our target for West Ryde for a tree coverage within the town centre was 11 to 14%. And within 800 metres of the train station, we set that to 22 to 30%. In this case, New South Wales has a target of 40%. So what this has actually uncovered for us is that, critically speaking, it's almost impossible to achieve 40% tree canopy coverage in a dense area like a town centre. You might be able to achieve that in residential areas outside the town centre, but within a town centre, you can imagine trying to jump from 6% tree canopy coverage to 40% would be near impossible. So all the other attributes that we calculated, this isn't all of them. This is some of the ones with pretty images. So we had tree canopy coverage, aspects of building. The building ones were generated through an external data source, Geoscape. It's not that expensive, but it's you do have to pay a little bit for it. Lot size, density of cycleways, job density, residential density, point of interest, so amenity, diversity, and density, street orientation, urban heat island, slope, topography, accessibility, all these different type of things we analyzed and did in the same lens as this to deliver some of those targets for us, essentially. What this also meant is when you calculate all those, you get a numeric value for each one of those attributes across 10 or 11 town centers. And you can feed that into a correlation matrix. For those not familiar, correlation maps the correlations between one attribute and another. So on the left-hand side, you've got a list of attributes. On the bottom side, you've also got the same attributes, just flipped. And essentially what it means is that a dark red means that they're positive correlations, which means that as one value increases, so does the other. A negative value, seen by blues, means that as one value increases, the other value decreases. So a simple explanation, if you have smaller lots, then you have more buildings, essentially. So that's a correlation. As you can imagine, a smaller lot means that a single building on each one of those lots, which means you have a greater building density within an area. Another thing might be more jobs means taller buildings. So as you can imagine, in town centres, there's a lot more jobs. To accommodate for those jobs, you need taller buildings and mix of users to accommodate for the residential and commercial floor space in that area. It did start to uncover some other little things for us as well. With greater permissible building height, it meant that there was more latent FSR. That means more unused FSR, which meant that planning controls were not meeting the criteria that they need to actually facilitate the floor space that was there. Either that or those town centres weren't capable of providing enough floor space in essence. Another one is that where there's a greater density of conservation areas and heritage, there's more intersections. So that kind of speaks to the historical planning of New South Wales, where these places were historically laid out not specifically for cars, but for people. And that meant that they were more walkable. And as studies have shown, increased intersection density is one of the key factors of walkability. So something that's happened in New South Wales over the past 50 to 100 years is that we've stepped away from these kind of human approaches to urban design and made them more building and car-centric, which in some places can be good, in some places it might not be. And if we're talking about place-based and human-centric design, then you'd imagine that pedestrianisation and walkability is a key factor. So in understanding through this correlation matrix, what attributes impact others, we can actually start to understand how urban design can impact the future outcome of a place. Some negative correlations, more vegetation coverage means less building coverage, more dwellings means less open space per person, and steeper topography means less urban heat island effect. So a lot of us talk to increasing open space means a place is more valuable because it reduces urban heat island, but it also provides for a greater population density, which in New South Wales is a strong sticking point in urban design to provide open space for people. So pairing that as well, because we're talking about a small area. So like I said before, on the national end, difficult to do the kind of qualitative aspects, but because we're on a small end, we also did a qualitative assessment to balance out the quantitative assessment that we did. We think this is super valuable because it gives you a lens that the data can't tell you, essentially. So our urban team down in Melbourne developed this framework for how you assess place from a qualitative lens. And basically it's an on-the-ground survey. So it was me going to 10 different places in the town centre, spending a couple of hours in each one of those places and answering 54 different questions about each one of those places, about what is this place in terms of safety, accessibility? Is it diverse? Is it enjoyable? Is it looked after? Is it enticing? And then from that, it's just a big spreadsheet and it pops out a number, and that number is its score out of 0 to 100. So in some places you can see here, this is a very busy road, Victoria Road, it scored 39%. Whereas some of the nicer places, so this lane right here, Graph Avenue and Anthony Lane, and then Anzac Park here, scored relatively higher, 64 to 63%, which meant those places were doing pretty well, or the best within the town centre. But it also meant that there was a factor that you could increase by. So by running the analysis again, but by answering it as if it was the outcome that you wanted, you then get a score of what is the desired future character or place attribution of that place. So for Graph Avenue and Anthony Lane, even though it did score 64%, we reckon it could potentially score 97% if it was designed to its absolute maximum potential. Understanding, of course, that the likelihood of that happening is very slim. The kind of place upgrades, place improvements that would need to make that place like that would be considerable. And it would mean that the council would have to invest a considerable amount of money to be able to deliver that. We then obviously mapped all that data out as well to present it. It's a bit complex to go over in particular, but we did label it quite clearly as this is a good place, this is the poor place, this is a great place, in essence. And then, we wanted it all to be great. One limitation of these processes, not a limitation actually, it was with the project, we couldn't bring it full circle. So the project changed about halfway through. Whereas what we wanted to do with all these attributions was to then implant our proposed scheme and then reassess it and see if we were actually getting our targets. The scheme changed, or the project changed, so we weren't actually able to go full circle on this. So we weren't actually able to reassess it against the qualitative or the quantitative analysis, unfortunately. So we actually don't know how well the result is performing in sense of that. But what we did do is use the findings from this qualitative and quantitative analysis to inform the principles and objectives that will be used over the next 20 to 30 years to build up the future of West Ryde. What I want to do as well is reflect on this process through what other people are doing. So Gale Architects and Urban Designers from Denmark, they have offices around the world. One thing they're doing is a considerable amount of on-the-ground surveys. They do it in Sydney and Melbourne every year, I think, but they do it for a vast majority of their projects. When I was doing my research, I spoke to one of the project leaders at Gale, and essentially they spend about 80% of their billable hours for a project surveying people using a place, which would be, given the way I imagine our fees are going in New South Wales, would be impossible without losing money. So what they're actually starting to do is to facilitate technology to deliver that kind of qualitative understanding of place. So like I went out and I stood in these places and I mapped out what people are doing and how they're using the space and what the space provides for them. We're actually using a new technology called Numina, which is basically this pillar thing that they attach to a light pole. It's got a camera in it, takes a photo every couple of seconds, analyzes that photo, and then deletes the photo, so it's completely anonymous. You don't actually understand. There's no privacy concerns there. And then analyzes the data to tell you how many people are using a space at a specific time, where are they moving, where are they going, how fast are they walking. It's also starting to implement pose detection, so it can actually tell you what those people are doing. Are they sitting, standing, walking, eating, drinking, those kind of things. So through this kind of combination of Gale's traditional techniques of mapping using their public live data protocol, they're using this new technology, Numina, to analyze what we're typically doing 80% of our time with human hours. They can now do with only a few human hours and analyze data to a much greater extent, because this thing sits on a light pole forever and it continuously pulls out data and feeds it back to the team. So if we're talking about, again, Cedric Price's question, if technology answer, what is the question? So if the question is, how do I analyze human movement and public life? Then maybe technology is the answer in that case to do that more thoroughly and more confidently in the results that come out of it. Another project that we've done using this kind of computational GIS analysis is Ku-ring-gai character study. So Ku-ring-gai is an entire local government area in New South Wales. It's just north of the river. From the last precinct, the town centre, West Ryde Town Centre, that was one train station. This has 8 train stations, plus a whole small other land around it. So a considerably large area to analyse. And basically we were enlisted to develop character statements for the entire area, basically. You can imagine understanding character across an entire LGA would be incredibly tedious and difficult and would take a particular knowledge of our place. One of our team members is Ku-ring-gai, so we were a bit more advanced in that aspect. But beyond that, how do we actually understand what that place is to the people that live there if we're not from there ourselves, especially of such a large and broad and diverse area? So what we did was, again, calculate a whole bunch of attributes based on and then attach them to as an average or a median to each one of these different boundaries. These boundaries are statistical area 1 boundaries from the 2016 census to try and refine the level of detail that we would have to go to for on-site surveys. So on the ground mapping, walking around streets and understanding what actually is different about these places. So we analyzed a whole bunch of different attributes. All of these were driven by open source data sets. So we didn't pay for any data for this. All of it done through GIS. So we used QGIS for this analysis. And all the maps are generated in QGIS automatically as well. So that I'm not drawing all these by myself. I'm just pressing a button. It automatically exports each and every single one of these attributes automatically to make my life simpler and easier, and make sure I'm not doing repetitive and tedious tasks, which I hate. And then what we did was feed it into a Python script outside of QGIS to do a K-means analysis to cluster all these different areas together, essentially, to understand what are the similarities between these areas. So to do that, we split it up into 8 buckets, and this is all done computationally. So you basically feed in all the different attributes of these. So each one of these different areas has a numeric value attached to it. Those numeric values are compared to each other and then colored based on their most similar aspects, essentially. So what that spits out is 8 different areas of similarity. So you can kind of see what's happening is this green and the yellow out here is all very similar. There's a big chunk of purple here. There's a big chunk of orange here. And then there's red and blue split along the train line and around town centres, and then this big teal one. What it also spits out is a bunch of data about what each one of those different colours means. So for instance, the teal cluster typically represents more lots. It has a lower vegetation coverage. It typically has more buildings per area. It has more consistent zoning and lot area, and it less diverse topography, so it's relatively flat. On the other hand, those orange areas, they're more inconsistent. There's a lot of heritage. There's bigger lot depths and smaller lot widths. So it talks about differences in historical planning in New South Wales. And basically what we did this for is to then zoom in and start to look at a map. So we overlaid this on an aerial map, start to zoom in, go through some Google Street View, and then do some on-site visits for the more particular stuff to understand, is this teal representative of where we would actually draw a different character area boundary, or where do we have to change it? Obviously, it's not super accurate. You get little spots sitting around in different places, just based on the attributes that are pumping out of it. So that's representative of the problem with the SA1 boundaries. Is the SA1 boundaries are defined by census and not by character, as you can imagine. and obviously changing in different size and shape. So the program does its best ability to represent the different clusters, but it will never be fully accurate without a lot more detail in the granularity of these blocks. So you can kind of see here on the left the cluster map, and then where we actually came to with the character areas, mind the color difference changes. But as you can see, the red and blue was identified as areas along the corridor and town centers, and that's more or less maintained as a similar kind of character. So St. Ives town center up here doesn't have a train station, but very similar characteristics of this. The orange we split into two because it is very similar, but we felt that the community would more or less argue with the differentiation of that being similar to this. So we had to split it up. This area here where you see quite a lot of diversity in different blocks, so you get about 4 or 5 different colors here, that was actually quite unique as it's kind of peninsula in the block. And then this purple area here became this teal color. And then this big area here represented by a teal here became a big purple. And then everything outside of that, these little peninsulas here were became green, and then everything outside of that is essentially just parkland and riparian corridor. So you can kind of see the similarities in how we use cluster mapping to identify where we should be drawing boundaries, and then we just refine the approach to drawing those boundaries through more manual methodology of going on site, looking at area mapping and stuff like that. Again, these are quite broad characteristics. So you're talking about an entire LGA that has 8 or 9 different character areas. So it's not super detailed, but it was enough to get us started. And then we essentially did the entire process again, but on a much more granular level, just for all the different town centers. So this is the town center on the left. The cluster mapping took block boundaries, so middle of a street to middle of another street. One critique I'd have of this is that if I were to do it again, I'd do it from the middle of a block as opposed to the middle of a street, because typically characters defined along the street edge, so on both sides of a street, as opposed to one character being on one side of a street and one character being on the other. And you can kind of see the similarities again between the cluster mapping and character areas. And the big major difference is we just kind of split this northern precinct up because there's a large heritage conservation area here that was slightly different. And then we introduced a more commercialized town center as a separate one as well. The problem with the cluster map in this case was that we had this block in here, which is essentially like this, it's nothing but parkland, and it's the only block of its type in this area. So that became its own cluster. Whereas if you took that out, I actually think that this area would identify itself, and then we would still be manually identifying the town center here. Again, reflecting on if technology is answer, what is the question? This one's quite interesting to me. It's the basis for which I thought about using similarity mapping and cluster mapping for the Guy project. It's a company in America, they're called Topos. And a quick quote from their website: "We use artificial intelligence to uncover the nuanced underpinnings of urban culture and the interaction between people and place." So they're driven by this ideology that places should not be defined by boundaries. So they looked at New York, and there's 5 boroughs in New York, and they did essentially what I did, but probably on a much more granular level with hundreds of data sets instead of 20 or 30. And they actually identified that these colors here are more representative of the different characteristics of 5 different boroughs in New York. But I imagine what would actually come out of this is if you did this much more granularly with a lot more clusters, you'd probably have 30 to 40 different areas of New York that are characteristically different. And basically, their target audience at the moment is real estate. So the way they use this kind of data is they've mapped a lot of major cities in America down to, I think, like basically like a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid to identify characteristics of those places. Like I said before, hundreds of different data sets. They use like street view imagery with semantic segmentation to identify streets with trees, where people are there, how many cars are on the street, alongside open source data set from the government and stuff like that. And what it essentially means, the service that they provide to their clients to essentially identify locations for new businesses and to generate how much revenue they might expect from that new business in that new location. So they basically have this portal where somebody can jump in and be like, I've got a store in this example, Williamsburg in New York. We know it's successful there because of the demographic of people that use our product. We want to open a store in Austin. Where is the best place in Austin to put that store? And with a certain degree of accuracy, they actually reckon the most accurate 100% percentile match is Cherrywood in Austin. So you can kind of see through this kind of similarity analysis what could be done in terms of identifying character, not just within one place, but across an entire country, essentially. To be able to do this, I can't even imagine the amount of processing that goes on in the background to be able to facilitate this, but it's quite immense. And again, reflecting on that technology question, if we are truly to identify different characteristics of place and character, then these kind of computational methodologies can work. But you do need to put a lot of effort into making them happen. But at the same time, how do we know that, like, it's just telling me that Cherrywood is the same as Williamsburg in New York? It's almost like you still have to do that qualitative analysis to understand what that place means for you and what it means to other people. Because if you're designing something, it's not just for you, it's for others as well. So again, if technology is the answer, what is the question? To us, technology in these quantitative aspects of character and place, it's not just about identifying character and place, it's a bunch of other things. It's about making our processes more efficient, accurate, and responsive. For us, it's a time-saving mechanism. We typically did a lot of site analysis manually. Now we can do 80 to 90% of that through computational analysis and GIS mapping. And like majority of our team actually use QGIS on a regular basis to generate analysis and do these kind of analyses really easily. How can we as designers offer our clients the best value for money, but also deliver the community better places? So there's an interesting statistic that the construction industry is one of the slowest to digitize and one of the least productive disciplines in the world. If we are to provide better value for money, then we have to increase our productivity. So one method of that is to use technology. So increasing reliance on computational methods to cut to the detail of things and make them more responsive and accurate, like the last question asked. And then again, how do we save time for design? Time saving. Computational methodologies allow us to front end our projects in a small amount of time so that we can actually spend the back end of a project designing places as opposed to worrying about drawing a map or analyzing a place to the nth degree. So if technology is answered, maybe those are some of the questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks immensely, Jordan. That was absolutely fabulous. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to first see if anyone has any questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them. I see here in the list a couple of colleagues from UTS. Linda, Nimish, hello. If you want, let me know and I can bring you into the panels. So while kind of these start to filter in, my first question, Jordan, and really it's an absolutely fascinating talk. And the first that I've seen that really addresses this question in a very kind of detailed way. How do you really measure quality? When you were doing your analysis of Westride and you had all these different measures, surely one of the most challenging factors is not to measure each one of those, is not to quantify each one of those measures separately, but what I would imagine is tremendously challenging is to find the relationship between those measures and how is building height, for example, driven by another measure. And you were doing that through that matrix, which I found fascinating. To what extent did you take that knowledge to be able to kind of extract useful data to help you better understand the place, but also to design for that place?
Yeah, that was a tricky one. Like I said, we could never go full circle in it. So what we tried to do was implement it again and reanalyze it. But because the scope of the project changed, we just couldn't do that. We didn't have enough time. There wasn't the ability to do that. So unfortunately, I can't fully answer your question. But I think in doing that analysis, we do have a firmer understanding, but beyond the quantitative analysis, there's other things that come into play as well in urban design that shapes the majority of what these outcomes are. So I think in that sense, it's hard to convince a client or a council that they should be doing something in a certain way when all they might care about is, I want the tallest building, or I want the biggest return for, I want the most yield or more floor space or whatever it is that the developer or client wants. So how do you balance that? So in a sense, I think doing that correlation matrix, we're able to understand what thing impacts another. So we could say to a client, well, actually, if you do that, then this is going to happen. For instance, like you can kind of confidently say with a certain amount of detail and accuracy what implications your design might have in a place. For instance, providing more open space through that correlation analysis suggests that you don't necessarily need a quantitative analysis to tell you this, but more open space is better for the community and the people that are there. So to a client, say a developer, if they want to be like, okay, I want more height on this building, then we might be like, okay, then maybe you need to give something back to the community, like an increased open space or a community asset in that sense. One problem with the correlation matrix, though, is that we only did that across like 10 town centres. If you wanted that to be truly accurate and representative of a full correlation across New South Wales or development in New South Wales, you'd probably do it for every town centre in New South Wales. Or,
wow,
you can imagine the kind of complexity involved in that. So you're setting up a lot of automation processes, but I think it's possible.
One question that's coming in, apart from identifying districts for commercial purposes, what are other practical applications of such research and cluster mapping?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it much beyond that project. For us, it was, we used it as a time-saving methodology, right? Like we used it so that we didn't have to go to every single street and walk it. And look at it and take photos of it and then present it to our client and the community. So that's the biggest value in it. I think, I'm not sure how to answer that beyond that. I think, the idea is that it just provides a more granular approach to identifying different characteristics, and then you still need to do the manual approach. I don't think you could ever, because boundaries are so flexible in terms of character and they're so fluid, you couldn't essentially draw a whole bunch of boundaries and expect it to outcome with like a 90 or 100% match to what actual character is in that place. That's going to be exceptionally difficult to do, or to, I mean, who knows which way computers are going, if there's a way that in the future machine learning could, or AI could figure out character from this kind of analysis to a reasonable estimation. But for us, it's just a matter of simplifying the complexity of analyzing place on such a granular level.
Super interesting. One kind of thing that I really find fascinating about this talk is it really kind of tries to, and I'm so glad that you used a quote by Jane Jacobs, because essentially we've been, well, throughout the past 100 years or so, we've been on this kind of loop trying to figure out how to design a city without designing a city, without kind of having a very top-heavy, top-down planning methods, by trying to design the city, by recreating the complex relationships that define what a city is. And that was kind of Jane Jacobs' kind of argument, that you can't really design a city like a machine, but you have to design a city by understanding the relationships between the local stakeholders within that city. And I think much of what you're kind of presenting today is really tapping into that. And of course, associated with that is a tremendous degree of complexity, absolutely tremendous. So much numbers, so much data. Surely there comes a point where, when is all of this data becoming just way too overwhelming? Or are we at a point where we have the tools possible to analyze this data, understand it, and put it to good use?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I think for a couple of, like, the difference between these two projects are West Ride, it was difficult for our client to wrap their head around what we were trying to do with the computational analysis. On the other hand, what we actually thought would be the inverse of this is that Green-Sky Council were very receptive to it. They understood it, they understood the need for it. This character analysis stuff is actually live. They have it on their website. It's a community-facing document. So they weren't concerned about how it was actually going to be perceived, which is very unusual for something like this, I imagine. Sorry, recap your question again, Mohammed.
Yeah, I know. That's just that. It's just the idea of perception and how do you kind of convince, those people, yeah?
Yeah, so I think the complexity of, like, the quantity of data can be complex, but if you represent it in a specific enough way. So when we talked to, the client, we didn't show them all of this stuff. We just showed them this, this, like
that must be frustrating.
and like we told them like the attributes, like the characteristics of those places, and we told them how we did it. We just didn't need to show them all of the different maps, right?
Interesting.
Those are for us.
Interesting.
So by reducing the representation to the client and the community, it makes it easier for them to digest. So it's about those, the key points. So I imagine that as the availability of data and the quantity of data increases, then raw complexity can increase, but as long as you represent it in a meaningful enough way, then it should be perceived in no other way than it is now. The complexity comes from you analyzing it, in a sense. That can be overwhelming.
Very interesting.
So I think that's where you need to start implementing automation processes in your techniques.
Right. The questions are starting to flood in, so I'm going to start to get through these now. I like how some people are already saying that they're going to have more questions by numbering them. Right, first things first, computational methods are not used widely throughout the industry. What is different about SJB that has enabled the practice to flourish in your eyes?
Independence. SJB Urban is a relatively small team. We're about 10 people at the moment. Each person in that team pretty much manages their own projects. You might get assistance from other people at different times, but they're your projects. For instance, this one wasn't my project, it was somebody else's. I was assisting on it, so I did a computational analysis for this. What makes SJB different about this is the independence. Like our director of architecture is more than willing to allow us the time to be able to venture into these type of methodologies because, as we said, it saves a lot of time and increases our confidence in our approach to it. So as long as you know how to do it at SJB, they will let you do it. So I'm quite confident in my abilities to be able to say to somebody, actually, I think I should be able to do it in this way. So to me, it's about skill building. So for me, as an independent urban designer, I built my skills up over the past couple of years to be able to do these kind of methodologies. I learned Python. I learned how to use QGIS quite proficiently and implement scripts inside and outside of QGIS and in Rhino and Grasshopper and stuff like that. And I just use those every day in my processes. And we started to implement a way for other people in our team to use it as well, even if they don't know how to script. It's just a matter of simplifying some of those processes. So if you're a skilled person in computational design, I'd say it's a matter of just how you approach it. If you're confident that you can do something in a particular way, then you should just do it. But understanding, of course, that clients have different expectations and it does play a factor in these kind of things. So you can't be wasting your time doing these things. Time saving is the primary factor of why we do these things.
Superb. So Linda asks, have you thought of tapping into public or existing camera networks to capture data? And if not, I'm probably going to put you in touch with Linda, like immediately after this lecture.
Yeah. No, I know of a couple of different service providers that do that kind of thing. I mean, I know what semantic segmentation is. I have no idea how to do it. So I thought about it. That's about as far as that goes.
All right, I'm definitely putting you in touch. Linda, keep an eye on your inbox. Right. Ifat is asking, so he's saying that, or they're saying using data solely can be quite dangerous. One question we need to answer is how to avoid possible structured or historical biases in data. This is important to avoid replicating or adopting a faulty model for decision making. Absolutely fantastic comment there.
Yeah, I mean, what we've done at SJB is build up our geospatial database over the last couple of years. There's a lot of manual work in there, making sure that the data is correct and accurate. I still make little changes every now and again when I'm looking at a large data set across like New South Wales and stuff like that. So yeah, accuracy and quality of data is a huge factor, but it kind of depends on the scale. Again, like West Ryde Town Centre, if you're talking about something of that scale, the data accuracy is more important. But on a Ku-ring-gai level, where you're assessing these kind of things because it's a bit more fluid, then you can get away with the problems that exist in the data sets from that perspective.
Sorry, Jordan, just to jump in, maybe to add, because I had a similar question from FATS. I think the concern is also that if, for example, you learned from every town centre in New South Wales, but that New South Wales happens to have had a history of horrible town planning, I think that's the concern. It's not that the data is incorrect, it's that the knowledge contained, it's a little bit like saying, if we do predictive policing, but it happens that we use the predictions based on horrible over-policing of the Black population, that inside of the data, not because of poor quality data, but inside of the data is contained strong biases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to reflect on that, you're absolutely right in that just because we're master planning a town centre doesn't mean we should be mastering planning a town centre like every other town centre in New South Wales. The problem is that clients expect you to do things in a certain way, and there's a certain way that development happens. So a lot of West Ryde was driven by tipping point analysis in terms of development feasibility, and development feasibility is based on historical planning and development situations in New South Wales. And those draw upon the other town centres in New South Wales. So agreeably, yes, comparing it to other town centres, even though those town centres might be bad, is one way to do it, but it's also it was the only way for us to represent the realistic outcomes for West Ryde.
No, and it's great, and it works really well for, especially with competing councils, to say, hey, look, your rival council on the other side of the train tracks has 20% more tree cover than you. Like, come on, you have to try harder.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
But I feel also, I mean, what one would imagine is that by doing this kind of comparative analysis, from, let's say, a client's perspective, you're able to tap into the client's perception. So if a client is familiar with a specific space and they like that space, so they say, you know what, I like that specific space. I don't know why I like that space. It's comfortable to walk down that street. Your data is able to try to identify various qualitative, quantified measurements associated with that space. I think that's a very nice trick there. One can also use that for the opposite. I hate that space. I don't want anything like that. And you can say, well, all right, this is the data associated with that space. And so perhaps we should move away from such measures.
Yeah. So like with the Ku-ring-gai one, it was more so about built form and public domain characteristics of place. So it didn't have that kind of qualitative lens attached to it, except from our own experiences in that place, like we did with West Ryde, because as you can imagine, over such a broad area. So it was about this kind of built form characteristics. So with, like 90% confident that the boundaries that we've drawn are representative of changes in built form. And a lot of the questions that we were trying to answer in that respect came from our planning department who were working with on this project. So we essentially asked them what are the characteristics, built form characteristics that define different places. And those are the things that we measured in a sense. I think, again, it doesn't identify everywhere like you need for granularity. Like there was this one particular street that was embedded within one of the largest clusters in this that was for like 100 meters, uniquely different to anywhere in New South Wales. Like completely different typology of building, different trees, different setbacks, everything was different, right? And it was for like 100 meters and that was it. But we weren't going to draw, like a tiny pixel on a big map, for the kind of different character that comes out of that place. So yeah, there's limitations in the data, but again, it kind of depends on the scope of what you're trying to achieve. So in this case, build form was our scope, and we were able to answer that question relatively accurately.
Right, so Ethan is asking, in reference to the slide which show the areas which you went to and analyzed, which, by the way, I mean, that's crazy, but in quantifying a number based on how the space caters for the people, what would 100% look like? Is that even possible?
I don't think so, because some of those questions relate to different types of places. So some are about streets, some are about open spaces and plazas. So you can't tick all the boxes because you can't place, well, you can have a shared street, but for the most part, it can't be a street and an open space,
Yeah.
So I think 100% would be theoretically impossible. But I mean, it depends on what you like. These are all just like very subjective questions. Again, if you think that there's a place in your mind that's 100%, but it's 100%, I'm not going to try and dissuade you from thinking that, your favorite place in the world isn't, that good. That's up to you to decide.
Super. Well, look, if you do find 100%, please let me know. Right, Nimish is asking, can you state what the character of one of the zones in your map actually is? So are you able to kind of, are you able to kind of identify, right, so what is the character?
I can't remember the character statements. As you can imagine, there were a couple of pages long for each one. But
I think theoretically, are you able to kind of say, right, so that location, that is the character. Is that something that we can comfortably conclude from this, or is that something that we shouldn't really venture into?
Yeah, you could, like in terms of built form characteristics, yes, you could do that. So like we were saying, these teal areas, they're typically more lots, there's a lot of vegetation cover, consistent zoning. Through a bit of, this is where we did a bit of qualitative analysis, through historical understanding of these places. So this area here, it was one of the latest areas to redevelop in Ku-ring-gai. Basically, it's this big flatter, not fully flat, kind of plateau, right? So there's the historical ridgeline that comes along here, and then everything here, here, and here falls away from that ridgeline. Whereas this area here was historically farmland, so it was a lot flatter. And it meant that when that farmland was no longer being used as farmland, it got subdivided into your typical lot layouts, which is why you see more consistent lot sizes, lot widths, lot depths, as opposed to these areas, which happen to be more organically, for instance, and are more defined by the topography, particularly in this area here. So the characteristic of this place is, well, yeah, it's a former farmland, very consistent street layout, very consistent block sizes, very consistent lot sizes, very consistent built form because it was all built in the 50s to 60s. Low tree canopy coverage. Just demoed all of it for farmland. That's the kind of characteristic of that place.
Very interesting. Okay. Nimish might jump in because I'm pretty sure he's going to have a couple of follow-ups. I'll just get through these next two questions. We'll get Nimish in and then we'll probably end it there. So this is a kind of a two-parter. So how do you see the role of computation and machine learning on helping identifying subjective urban design qualities of the space that inform the process of urban placemaking?
Yeah, I mean, reflecting on a couple of those different things, maybe not Topos, but this one is, if you can thoroughly analyze what's happening in a place through machine learning or artificial intelligence to answer some of those kind of questions that we're asking here, then sure, it's a viable methodology and you can do it a lot more confidently and more accurately because you're using it across a much larger, more accurate data set that's taking into account a lot more factors. How you would do that, I don't know at this stage. I'm sure there's people out there that are looking at this kind of thing. There's a growing kind of discipline of machine learning and AI in the architecture and urban design industry, primarily in academic senses. But as you know, Mohammed, who's developed a machine learning approach to urban design, they are extremely complex and hard to wrap your head around.
Absolutely.
And it takes an extremely skilled person to be able to approach something from that sense. From a machine learning aspect, I know that you either have to have a very solid data set or you have to create your own, which takes a lot of time. And then you also have to train your model as well on that data set and make sure that it's outputting what you want it to output. So it's time consuming, but it's kind of also not, because once you set it up once, it should work again and again and again. So you might set it up one time and it might take 6 months, and then all you have to do is click a button.
Yeah. I mean, even with that, one must factor in a level of abstraction within that. It's just very difficult to tackle every aspect.
Yeah, like if we talk about that Jane Jacobs quote, like organized complexities, complexity theories of cities, and if I don't know if he's here today, Egbert, who's also a professor at UTS, is very thoroughly aware of, and I spoke to him a lot about this during my research. It's not in the near future anyway, I don't think computational methodologies will ever answer every single question that you need to know about a place. I think there's a lot of groundwork that needs to happen, which is why we believe that good urban design is a balance between data and experience.
Right, and then data and gathering data seems to be the main impediment or facilitator for running such analysis for an architectural design office. What are some of the rich and reliable data sources you'd recommend? Let's start with the free ones.
I mean, yeah, I wasn't going to mention it. Pay for. If you did want to pay for something, Geoscape is a very good source of data. It's the only one that we pay for. Beyond that, if you go to seed.newsouthwales.gov.au, that's the New South Wales open data portal. You do have to do a bit of searching to try and find what you're looking for. Some very good ones are like the tree and vegetation cover. There's a lot of attributes attached to those. Let me have a look at a map so I know what I'm talking about. Google or here have a lot of things about amenity and use of things. If you can scrape stuff off like Facebook or Instagram, I'm not sure if you can still do that anymore. You can understand the kind of tags that attach to places. So I can kind of tell you the amenity and activity of a place. There's topographic data. If you search Elvis elevation, there's a national topographic data sets that comes down to 1 meter accuracy. It's exceptionally high value to us. There's an urban heat island and heat vulnerability data set as well, which was delivered alongside the tree canopy one. So that kind of tells you what you kind of need to mitigate in terms of your building footprint and stuff like that. Yeah, beyond that, I mean, census is extremely broad. There's a lot of stuff there. The ones we use are typically residential density and job density. We don't typically venture into anything more than that. If you can use it, Microsoft released building footprint data for all of Australia. I don't use that data set. I have my own methodology of procuring building footprints. It's a little bit more difficult, but a bit more accurate. But that is a solid data set. Those are some of my favorites. But there's a whole host of data sets. I mean, it's kind of like, well, what's applicable to your project? We use like urban heat island, tree canopy, residential density, and then this typical like LEP, so land zoning, height of building data. If you were to procure, if you just wanted generic GIS information for your site, if you go to 6 Maps Clip and Ship, that's the easiest way to access, topographic information, lot information and stuff like that. And with each one of those, because it's GIS and shapefile format, each one of those different items, it comes with a whole bunch of different characteristics that you can use to analyze in different ways.
I hope whoever asked that question had a pen handy. Right. Last, Nimish. Nimish is, we invited Nimish into this. So Nimish, hello. Nimish is he is a colleague here with us at UTS, and he's worked a lot on the urban realm. Nimish, over to you.
Yeah. Hi, Jordan. Wonderful lecture. I just had a couple of questions, actually. Well, not so much as questions, more reflections, actually. So, like, one thing I'm still wondering, like, when you're describing character versus we're talking about attributes of urban space, actually. I mean, how are these different? You know, like, it's almost like numbering attributes and then actually saying, well, these attributes build up the character of this place. Or is it something different? Because what I'm wondering, let's say the amount of analytics that you're actually showing here versus that central question, which I'm still wondering, like, what is if technology is the solution, what is the question? You know, so I'm still wondering what that spatial question actually is in your case. Like, and maybe it differs for different projects, but also what is this role of multi-criteria overlay analysis, or something where you actually weight certain attributes more than the others, depending on the nature of the project that you're actually going to be dealing with?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that we're still exploring and understanding, like which are the most valuable attributes that we can measure that actually define what a place is, or how do you define what character is. So yeah, with those attributes, yeah, character and place attributes are all the same, but these ones that are measurable are, you know, easiest to source and procure and analyze, but the most valuable ones to us are the qualitative aspects of place. So what does that place mean to you? So there's a whole host of these attributes that you can quantify but measure, but to us, the most important characteristic is, yeah, meaning and place-based attribution. On your point of
Because it's
weighting,
interesting, right? Like, any intervention that you make based on your analysis is also going to actually change the behavior of people who are actually operating in that space itself.
yeah,
Therefore, to preempt, like, making this intervention or, let's say, an urban proposition in there would actually be beneficial or not beneficial, and how do you analyze that as a firm who's actually doing this? Do you have some mechanisms in place to actually understand what was the impact, say, for instance?
Yeah, like I said, we wanted to feed it through this and to understand what the actual outcome would be, and did it change attribution and stuff. But again, anytime you change something, so like if you're master planning a town center, new buildings, taller buildings, more open space, things are going to change, and it means that the character of that place is more than likely going to change. The intent of this is to understand what the current character is and how to best mold your design into that character, so there's, yeah, the effects are mitigated in a sense. And that's where kind of experience in urban design comes into place. Is just trying to mitigate the impacts in a sense and do what's best for the future community. Understanding that, of course, you know, maybe there isn't a strong character there already and you want to make it better. How do you do that, you know? And we're talking about projects, you know, it's like, it's the same as talking to like an economic feasibility analysis. Like, it's like, they'll tell you that they can't tell you what's going to happen in 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't really tell you what's going to happen in 30 or 40 or 50 years when this place is finally built, you know? Like, it's going to have to go through a whole series of another analysis periodically to understand what's shaping and changing, what the character in place is. So yeah, we can do our best, but in a total sense, there's a lot of unknowns with this. But if there's computational methodology that could, you know, simulate a future environment and tell you what's going to happen based on your changes, then yeah, I'd welcome that kind of analysis. It'd be super interesting to see.
We all would, for sure.
Yeah.
Jordan,
Actually, also, sorry, have you also worked in a way that, let's say, if you work on a particular, or if you're aware of a particular index, let's say, for instance, a health and well-being index, and you're actually trying to, let's say, do your analysis based on how would you be able to achieve, you know, the propositions of that particular index, and therefore you calculate backwards in terms of how would you actually change urban form, urban morphology, street networks, you know, certain such things. Because my problem is sometimes I'm not able to see, let's say, for instance, a simple question like, which streets to pedestrianize, because of which you might actually increase, let's say, economic shop fronts would actually benefit. There will be more social cohesion, so and so and so. And then that becomes a very specific question, because of which maybe you might not go analyzing. Let's say you might actually pick 6 out of these and say, well, even out of these 6, actually these 3 are the most prominent ones and therefore the most weighted ones that would go into even a Python script that you write actually. And they would therefore be weighted in terms of understanding which particular notion to capture. Otherwise, urbanism is so huge. I mean, in terms of even understanding the whole context is like, it's a humongous task, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, like the scale of urban design, even if you're doing a small place, yeah, from a town center to an LGA, it changes. And at some point you realize that whatever you do is probably going to change in the future anyway. Like we work in projects where it was master plan like 2 years ago, and there's another master plan happening, you know, like things inevitably change. A lot of us are driven by economic considerations. So yeah, I think analyzing, you know, like you said, but like what if you were to pedestrianize this road or something like that, I guess that's where like traffic modeling comes into play. So it might not necessarily be about you analyzing data, but if you have a consultant on board that does have those capabilities to deliver a firmer understanding of that. Like West Ride, we did have traffic analysis, and they told us, no, you can't pedestrianize that street, much to my dismay. You know, those kind of things. So it's like, you know, but if, again, there's problems with that because a lot of traffic modeling is based on current and future traffic scenarios that all involve cars.
Yeah.
What if there weren't any cars in the future? You know, what's that going to change? And I think, yeah, like you're hitting on a strong point, is that like how much can you feasibly impact on through these kind of methodologies? And I honestly don't know. Like I said, we use these as a time-saving methodology to try and get a bit more accurate understanding of a place. But the actual design and the outcomes of a design is a huge qualitative process led through, you know, experienced design intellect.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Nimish.
Jordan, following on from that, my question was about, my suspicion is that there's an inverse correlation between traffic speed and the quality of a place, that if I had to pick a single indicator, that I would probably pick that. Is that something that has been borne out by your analysis?
I think it's something that we constantly struggle with. Is a huge part of urban design in New South Wales is led by, what does RMS say? So for people out there, Roads and Maritime Services. What will they let you do?
They have too much power by far.
They do.
And
so
somebody forgot that their job was to help a city be better, and all of their KPIs are anti-city.
Exactly. So if an entire place strategy is led by cars, then, you know, like you said, there is an inverse correlation in that you can kind of see here the least, or some of the least quality places are around very busy, highly used, trafficable streets. So maybe there's, even if you were to assess and understand that the roads might not change anytime soon, what things can you do to mitigate the effects of those busy roads? So for us, for West Ride, what we said is that at the moment there's a lot of active frontage on Victoria Road. We were actually, what if you turn that inwards? So in this area here, we were turning it in. So Graf Avenue and Anthony Lane would have the active frontages. So for those busy, you know, the shop fronts where people would be walking around, they're not anymore in this public domain where it's very noisy and full of pollutants, but it's in this protected way. And then along here, we had some taller buildings to mitigate the effects of noise. So yeah, through that kind of, you know, you don't necessarily need data to tell you that. That's kind of, you know, just an intuitive response to what places are. Yeah, I'd like to see in the future if, you know, places could be less car dependent. And like I said, we struggle with trying to propose things where the future doesn't involve cars. And you know, like we work on some big projects, you know, like you might be working on a Metro project, and Metro are actually quite visionary in their response because their entire approach to design is led through public transport and accessibility. So they actually fly in the face of what RMS say, and they're like, actually, we're going to change this road network, we're going to pedestrianize it, because by the time we actually build this metro station in 30 years, then what are we talking about here? Like, and with a rapid generation of car technology, I don't think it's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years, but maybe in 50, 60 years, there might be less of a reliance on cars. And even if there is a strong reliance of cars in the future, places should be led by public transport and people-based movement, not sitting in a tin box and driving places independently, but talking to people on your commute.
So now that you showed this slide, I think it's great. That was my second question is it slightly dangerous to put those dark green circles where in some ways the message is, and I wonder if you really believe this, in some ways the message is the planners can't F it up, that a designer could come and repair over the top of really bad initial decisions. I mean, if you still got 81 on the main street, but the message in some ways is, it'll be okay, get us back later. Even if you screw it up now, you'll be okay. When actually a lot of the story of New South Wales planning is not that. They have effed things up and they're irreparable, like more or less irreparably.
Yeah, I agree. I think because this is just based on what is the absolute best score it could achieve if you could actually do all of those different things. And I think I agree. If I were to do this process again, I'd probably apply like a pro rata reduction to each of those different places, which takes into account a sense of realism. And a big part of this project as well is what we had to identify the place improvements that we were offering the community. And in a lot of cases, the development that we were proposing wasn't enough to actually pay for those place improvements. So if we were to go through because the front end of this project where we did this was different to the back end of the project, unfortunately. If we were to do this again, we'd revisit it in sense of those place improvements that we were recommending and start reducing some of these scores, essentially. Yeah.
Nice. But it's a super powerful concept.
Super. So I'm kind of wary of time and not taking too much of your time, Jordan. This has been fantastic. It truly has. And I'd like to thank everyone who has attended with your fantastic questions and for your attention. So Jordan thankfully accepted for this recording of the session to be uploaded. Once we have that ready, we will upload it. So please keep an eye on the UTS Architecture Instagram page. We'll probably announce it there. And in the meantime, if I can just share my screen for a quick second. Our next lecture is on the 14th of September by Christian Derricks, Director of Derricks Associates and former Director of Super Studio at Woods Bagot? Super something.
They called something like that, Super Space. Jordan, you probably know.
It was Super Space, but
Super
Space doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, so please feel free to join us there. In the meantime, thanks again for everything, and I really hope that you guys join us in the future lectures. Again, Jordan, thank you immensely for your time. And,
thank you so much, Jordan. That was awesome.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for all the questions. It's great to answer them.
Superb. Thanks all. See you later, everyone.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye.